Hi, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join our webinar today, where we will look into how to improve your SEO performance with Define Media Group. And to start off, I'd like to start with a short introduction. I'm Thomas Silokos. I'm strategic consultant here at Similarweb. With me, I have Roy Hinkes, who's head of SEO at Similarweb. And of course, we have guys from Define Media Group. We have Marshall, who's a founder. And we have Adam Shirk, who's VP of SEO and Digital Strategy, and Shazad Abbas, who's VP of Digital Media. And guys, if you can please introduce yourself more and maybe tell us about what Define Media Group is, what you guys consult on, and what is your focus on in the industry.
Sure. Hey, good morning, everybody. Appreciate the time. My name is Marshall Simmons. I'm the founder of Define Media Group. Define is a boutique consulting firm. We specialize in enterprise audience development and search engine optimization. We were actually born in the New York Times in 2004 and started our consulting business within the New York Times under the umbrella of the New York Times Company and spun off in 2011. Our focus is on large enterprise publishers and data content sites, data-driven sites. Work with a lot of different blue chip publishers on the East Coast and West Coast and throughout the world. Our focus is engaging with editorial teams, heavily into product and tech as well. As you can see, we're a three-person consulting firm. And so our process is to instill SEO best practices across all different departments and organizations. As I mentioned, we work closely with editorial, technical, design, marketing teams to implement search engine strategies across the board.
No, I think this is great. And the really important thing to realize is that you guys work in an industry where content and SEO is crucial to the bottom line, to the overall traffic. So I think this is probably why I'm really excited to have you here on this webinar and tell us how to do SEO and content correctly.
It's a great point. You could have the best technology stack in the world, but if you're not producing interesting, compelling content on literally a daily basis, there's nowhere for that traffic to go. So they're technical, editorial, and marketing. It's really three foundational pillars, that each of which is vital.
Yeah, so I think the next we're going to talk through the points that we're going to cover, and the first one is changes to the content industry and really the evolution of organic search. Then we'll look into politics of SEO in large organizations, which come up as an issue in a lot of across SEO world all the time. Then website auditing processes, and then best ways to find relevant and trending content. And at the end, we'll look into measuring performance and reporting frameworks. One thing I really want to mention is that one of the main reasons we do these webinars live and not as a recording is that we want to have it more as a discussion with people who join us. So please, guys, don't forget to ask questions throughout the webinar using the questions panel, as we really want to hear from you today, and we'll try to answer your question during the webinar and at the end as we leave about 10 minutes to answer additional questions. And without further ado, Adam can start us on the first point, on the first section of our presentation.
Great. Yeah, so we want to talk a little bit about changes to the content industry, kind of how organic search is evolving as a traffic opportunity. And so just to set a little bit of context here in the next slide, if we look, Define tends to work with a number of large-scale news and content sites, and so this is just a cross-section of sites across the industry, not necessarily companies that we're directly working with, but for them right now, and this is looking at last 12 months for the United States, organic search will typically represent anywhere from 20 to over 50% of all traffic coming into the site in a given period. So it's obviously tremendously important channel, one that's growing. We've seen a lot of evolution of that over the years too. I mean, particularly for the big brands. I should mention too, for the really large established brands, in most cases, direct is going to continue to get the largest percentage, just simply because so many people will direct navigate to the homepage and just interact with those brands in other ways. But nonetheless, we've seen over the last 10+ years, the contribution from organic search continue to grow. Now, we certainly saw the rise of social happen as well, And that doesn't necessarily impact the raw numbers to search, but it can impact the percentage contribution, which is fine. It's good to have more from both. But there was a point just a few years ago where social was evening out and even overtaking organic search. But then we saw a lot of changes in that sector, and it kind of flipped it back around. And so a lot of that leveled out. Social still vital, but came down a bit in terms of overall contribution, and organic search really became the primary channel again. Again, we tend to work with news and content sites, and so that's the range we see. We tend to work more with B2C publishers, so that 20 to 50% we see. Other categories, B2B, you may see those percentages go higher. Brands that aren't necessarily as well established, those percentages could go higher as well, just because less people are coming direct. And so, you know, we could see that percentage even go up to 70% or more in some cases. Now that's good, because that means organic search can bring you an awful lot of traffic. But with that opportunity also comes risks through dependency, because if organic search, and particularly Google, is your primary driver, and Google changes some things or has a big update, or you have some technical issues that impact search traffic, that percentage can be radically impacted, you know, literally overnight. And so it's really important to take steps to do everything you can to leverage that. And so it's really kind of about diversifying your portfolio, really. Like, it's great that organic search is a healthy percentage, but what we really care about more than anything, and we'll touch on this in the tracking section, is just sort of long-term growth and raw numbers, and we want to see all those channels going up.
So even though, sorry, even though you said with a lot of algorithm changes and everything, you can still see a growing proportion coming from organic. Is that right?
In many cases, yes. And it depends a little bit on where the site is in its sort of life cycle of sort of institutional SEO and, you know, technical issues it may have. And what we're going to see in a minute, sometimes the best and the strongest domains still just get the rug pulled out from under them.
Yeah, no, that's definitely interesting. And yeah, Shazad.
So one of the things I think that we try to espouse is the idea of converting sort of earned to own media. So basically, you know, you have shoulder terms, you know, that are driving traffic. You know, there are high volume terms, competitive terms. Maybe you're doing well for those. Eventually, what you want to see in an ideal world is actually, you know, especially if you have a high organic percentage of traffic, to hedge against that risk that Adam was talking about. What you want to do is actually see the direct go up. So we don't necessarily always want organic search to continue to rise and rise, right? Again, that just puts you at risk. What we want to do is really establish the brand, and the direct piece of it is really a reflection of the power of the brand, and that's the most powerful mechanism for keeping that site in a healthy place from the perspective of, you know, its brand power, but also the sources of traffic that it's getting. And so one of the things that we try to do is have organic search lead into something like direct traffic increases.
That's a great point. We want the raw numbers continually going up, but we don't necessarily want the percentage to grow.
Okay, so you're basically trying to translate this non-branding traffic into branded and more organic traffic as well through the future. So like if someone is brand agnostic at first, you want to make them more relevant to your brand as the audience.
That's correct.
They also, from what I understand, they want to increase the total traffic of the website and the publisher, and not directly to specific channel. So they want to increase and organic and indirect. So each channel will basically increase their own traffic, and they want to increase it across the board, not just specific on organic.
Yeah, that's a good point too.
Also, I think that just to add this, during this COVID and all this outbreaking news publishers have gained massive amount of traffic through organic search in the past couple of months.
Yeah,
so,
it's absolute. When you look at the trend lines across publishers is sort of like it's like, it looks like a mountain, to be frank, like right from March, like it's up, up, up. But then of course, once you hit the peak, it does start to come down. And some of that is seasonality with summer and all of that. But it was obviously a tremendous amount of search activity around anything related to COVID-19.
Yeah, one interesting analysis that I've done just during COVID-19, it was I looked at the publishers and looked at the share of traffic coming from organic versus direct and other channels. It was interesting that in the beginning, when people didn't actually know where to find the best information on coronavirus and all that kind of stuff, the organic share increased first, and then direct went and stabilized after time when people actually understood, okay, so CNN or some other places have relevant information for it, and then it kind of like actually stabilized. But you can see that when people don't know where to find information, that's the opportunity for you to gain a market share, and then direct takes over back.
Okay, and then as we move on to the next slide too, like we were saying, Google's a little bit of a double-edged sword. Like it's a great provider of traffic and audience, but there are a lot of issues that can impact traffic at any given time. And so we'll briefly go through some of these, but obviously a really big one is Google core updates and frankly other types of unannounced updates and adjustments that can happen as well. Like if you, in that first chart on this screenshot above, like that's actually tracking top stories visibility for a number of different news sites, but you can be cruising along the leader of the pack, and all of a sudden one day, just overnight, your visibility could be down 20, 30, 40% or more. And these are also not, these updates are algorithmic, right? So it's not necessarily targeting specific sites. And a lot of times it does help to filter out some of the lower value, lower quality stuff, but it's just as common for quality reputable publishers on very strong domains to also get caught up in these updates. And maybe it's because of things they aren't doing quite as well, like I don't know, excessive tag pages or some ad related issues or some UX barriers, maybe some non-editorial content that's kind of messing with the overall sort of quality signals for the domain. But other times it's not, like they've been going along, business as usual for some time, and overnight these updates can hit them, and it's really important for everybody to dive in and troubleshoot and remediate as best as they can. And sometimes that's technical stuff. It does also get into content quality and the whole expertise, authoritativeness, and trust. And again, big publishers, big newsrooms, subject matter expertise, like you don't know, your day-to-day content production is not necessarily gonna have to worry about that sort of quality, but again, because all this stuff is algorithmic, if word count is a little bit low, if you're not necessarily leveraging that expertise as well as you can on the site, it can happen to anybody.
So yeah, I think this is interesting because it didn't affect just small publishers or really small site. It affects even big ones who are technically good at the industry, good brand authority, and everything else. It should be kind of in place to have that visibility, right?
In 2019, we saw more change than we've seen in years. And Adam and I have been in the industry since the late 90s. And so that's saying a lot, but 2019 was all over the map, and it affected everybody. It affected startups all the way up to large enterprise level publishers. So nobody is quote unquote safe from these types of updates. And that's why, SEO is never finished. It can't be treated as a one-off project. It requires constant attention, resources, technical resources, because something is going to shift. The expertise, authority, trust algorithm was a large one last year, and that one really did, and the years before. And I mean, several years back, I mean, it has evolved significantly as Google starts to focus on your money, your life, and health-related sites and information. COVID is no exception to that. And so to your point that you were making earlier, Thomas, is that, yeah, in the beginning, there was a lot of flurry around information around COVID, but Google has started to adjust those and really has started to move back to big brands around some of these topics. And that has been an international push. And so we continue to see these types of changes happen. not just across publishing, but across all types of different verticals.
Yeah, and so we've got other challenges too, and so we'll go through some of these just briefly. But we see a lot of shifts in the search result themselves as well. Like there are changes to top stories carousels fairly often. I mean, how they were powered years back changed, or sometimes it's good changes. Like there are some publishers now seeing in the top stories cards a second link that's called for context, where you get your main story featured with a thumbnail image and then a text link below for a second story from the same source. That's potentially good. Having AMP not be a requirement for mobile top stories coming up next year, that's a huge change. We'll get into AMP shortly as well. But what we're also seeing that can impact this a lot, and a lot of this tied into coronavirus stuff, excuse me, is increased localization, and we're talking about internationally. And so Google made the decision that they wanted to favor local sources in specific international markets, which kind of makes sense on one level. If you're in the UK, you want UK sources probably to get the most relevant information. But let's imagine you're a multinational organization, and okay, you're US based, but you have a fully staffed newsroom in London for UK. You've got a fully staffed newsroom in Hong Kong or Singapore to handle Asia. But suddenly those teams are producing all kinds of locally oriented coronavirus coverage that is directly applicable to people in those regions. And yet the domain, because it's associated primarily with the US, gets filtered out in those markets. And we saw when that change happened, we saw overnight visibility for those queries go to nothing. And again, we understand the intent of it, but something that happens at the algorithmic level can't necessarily factor in specific cases that don't match up as well. And so publishers had really had to adapt to that and kind of change the way they covered that. See a variety of other features as well. If you're covering the stock market, you try to do search on a stock symbol, especially on mobile, you can get pretty far down the screen before you even get to organic results, because there's so many things that Google's placing in there.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very interesting point about localization of content, because it might not directly correlate with the quality of traffic, because what we imagine Google always does is to improve quality. And if it's on algorithm based, it's not always correct. So I think to your point it's very important to understand that it's not always 100% correct way of doing it, and it's not always the best will win.
Yeah, it's true. We see weird glitches from time to time as well. Like there's every now and then there are bumps in the roads with indexation, and we don't mean on the publisher side, because that, by the way, happens all the time too for a variety of technical reasons. But there are periods where for a couple hours, or maybe sometimes a little bit longer, Google has some issues with prompt indexation of timely news content that can really mess with people's visibility and numbers on a given day. We see some glitches with timestamps too, not all the time, but more often than we'd like, where you've just published an article, but in the first paragraph it happens to reference a date from a few days back in context of the news. Or maybe you've got a big photo, and that photo happened to take place the week before, and it's got a date and the timestamp. And we see basically what we see happen in top stories or just the regular search results is, for whatever reason, instead of getting the proper timestamp below the headline and associating that with the article, they're pulling one of these older dates. That suddenly makes the content look outdated. And if the content is believed to be 4 or 7 days old, it's not going to get featured in top stories like it should. And so those things can be out of a publisher's hand, but it does mess with visibility. Then, of course, the bigger buckets are just all kinds of adaptations and changes that publishers need to make because of things that Google is pushing. Several years back, AMP was the big push. It still is to a degree, and still a tremendous traffic driver, by the way. But they took a lot of technical resources to get that going. And AMP is something that also breaks all the time, and so you constantly got to be monitoring it. Core Web Vitals is a newer example. You know, that's suddenly going to be ranking factor next year. We've got new metrics. We've got Lighthouse 6, version 6, kind of factoring in the scoring of page state insight scores differently than it used to. And so like there are technical and product teams across all kinds of organizations right now that are doing, you know, head to toe evaluations of how they score in these things and what changes they need to make. And everybody knows it's really easy to make pages faster if you don't have to do things like track for analytics or make a living with advertising or do other types of promotional links. Like, you know, those are necessary evils. And so, you know, it's a real challenge.
Yeah, no, it's usually that's the problem I have when I speak to developers and I say the page is too slow. They say there are too many tags, but I cannot really remove tags. They are necessary thing to have. So it's always something that you're trying to make it better, but you have to have it there. So it's a necessary evil to have, as you said.
Yeah, one of the things that we talk about from an SEO perspective is that we can't be myopic. We can't just assume that SEO and search is the most important thing, most important initiative in an organization. It can't. So our job is to prioritize and then reprioritize and then reprioritize that prioritization over and over and over to get it in alignment with the tech roadmap and the product roadmap. Because SEO is never going to be the most important thing. It's not. And so we have to find the balance, as you're referring to, Thomas.
Yeah, we actually have two questions that are probably relate to this section a bit. And as we talked about quality of content, there's a question, is it compulsory to have an image and a video and a blog post if the content is less than 300 words? Is there something that people should include?
So, sorry, I was just going to say, listen, I don't, compulsory is I don't know if that's the right approach when we're looking at, you know, taking a look at issues like this. I think it certainly helps. You know, you're not penalized for it, right? Like you can still get indexed because whether you have, you know, images or not, and really there's no specific word limit that Google espouses when it says, you know, it'll index your content. Really what it comes down to is, and this is a little bit, you know, cliche, but it really does come down to the best user experience you can provide for that specific content for your specific users. And that's what you should think about. Like you shouldn't think about word count. You shouldn't think about, you know, whether you should have X amount of images because you think that there will be a correlation between that and rankings. I think organically it'll come if you're looking to actually understand what it takes to actually, you know, be competitive in search results for the target keyword for that page, then do the competitive analysis, right? I think that should give you a good framework. And more than likely, you'll find that video and images are probably part of like the content strategy that you should be employing for that specific content. But compulsory is not the right approach because that seems to indicate that if you don't have it, you won't rank, and that's just not true.
Yeah, I think that's a very good answer. And I think one more that relates to this section as well is, does AMP impact accelerated mobile pages, impact publishers' traffic and ability to generate revenue? I think this is very interesting because it's quite an important thing that a lot of people avoid, even not in publisher industry. So if you can tell us more about this and the impact on the industry.
Yeah, well, AMP works. AMP drives a lot of traffic. AMP breaks all the time. AMP is hard to track. It's hard to run ads on. It's hard to run video on. It's a necessary evil. And there's no doubt it has to be a recommendation. We recommend it, I would say almost all the time. If you're not on it, if you can qualify and make it and get it into your roadmap and implement it, there is a lot of traffic to be had. We see a pretty significant increase in overall traffic as it relates to AMP content. And so there's no denying that it's important. It should be part of an overall search strategy and traffic driving strategy. But there's a lot of headache that comes with it. And Adam was talking about that headache before as well. It breaks a lot, and it's rare that you go into Search Console and see no errors around AMP content. It's a bit of a whack-a-mole style scenario, but there's no denying that it still continues to drive a lot of traffic. Even if we're now just starting to see the beginning of the end of AMP, which 2 years from now, I don't know if we're having the same conversation, but for now, it is significantly important.
So it's something you have to have, but there are a lot of issues that come with it and a lot of opportunities that come with it at the same time.
Spent years helping publishers get off separate mobile URLs on m.dot subdomains, and it was all about responsive and adaptive, and then boom, got to do separates, and then now with Core Web Vitals, AMP's not going to be required for top stories, but we still don't know what will be favored after one over the other. So it remains to be seen, but it wouldn't be the worst thing for that to evolve out.
No, that's great. Yeah, I think we can jump into the second section. Yeah, please guys, take on.
So when we're talking about, so if you're in the States right now, politics we're a bit shell-shocked when it comes to the term politics in general. And it has a bit of a dirty connotation, but it's more about buy-in, right? It's more about how do you align within the organization to get in line with business objectives, right? So how does SEO play into the larger business objectives? When is it time to start an SEO project if you're a startup, for example? And then more importantly, how do you get momentum? So I'm not even talking about necessarily even getting a budget per se, because you don't necessarily need a budget. I operated at the New York Times for many years without a budget, for tools, for anything. It can be done. Now, of course, having a budget is good. And so I'll talk about that in a second, but it's just about alignment in the organization, strategically, and then tactically. And so when I say buy-in, I'm just talking about momentum towards an SEO objective. So there's a lot of things that we talk about in this regard. Basically, like, how do you staff an SEO team? Do you need a staff? Do you need a full-time developer? We find some of the most successful SEO programs within large enterprise organizations have a dedicated full-time developer that isn't pulled off to other projects. Somebody that can put attention and time towards your roadmap, the SEO roadmap, and then of course fixing ongoing errors and changes, that algorithmic changes and things that require a pop-up or some type of new initiative that you can address. So we also see like where it should live in the organization. Overwhelmingly, we find that it can be the most impactful when it sits in product and marketing. Sometimes those are two different divisions, but product for the most part, because SEO, I mean, when you can consider SEO from the outset and not have it bolted on later in the 11th hour, I think we all know and have been have had a major project brought to us just before it launches and says, hey, can you go optimize this? Which that is, I think we've all felt that before, that pressure before. So when you can sit SEO in product, you really do have an influence from the very beginning, from the wireframe stage or from the idea stage. And so you're not so reactive. So there's different components that we look at. The first thing that we do at Define is always manage expectations and level set. We use Similarweb a lot to level set, and I'll talk about some of that in a second, because if you're not managing expectations, if you're not gauging overall interest and then an understanding of what the expectation is, you're probably setting yourself up to fail, because you need to be able to talk realistically about what the benefits are, the potential benefits of engaging in a particular SEO project, what those are. And you have to benchmark that success, right? You have to benchmark current organic performance. And we do that in a number of different ways, and I'll talk about that in a second. We have to look at and prove out the SEO objectives and how that fits into the overall business objectives of the company. They have to be in alignment, and it has to show that it needs to be a catalyst to an end that the entire company is working for, whether that's subscriptions, more purchases, maybe just more clicks. And then you have to identify and engage with the stakeholders to get everybody on board. And that's an important part to this too, is everybody has to understand what the objective is. A very simple objective when it comes to SEO and how that aligns with the overall business objectives. I mean, I think right now, in the time of COVID, for example, live blogging has been a really interesting acceleration from an SEO perspective, and it has become extremely important. I mean, and that is just one way to get in and identify what the particular pain points are for each individual stakeholder. That's something that is very important when it comes to buy-in, is understanding where that person's pain point is and what their objectives are, what their business objectives are, what their goals are for that quarter, for that fiscal year, et cetera. And then finally, we analyze the competition. So on the next slide, one of the things that we do is competitive data is a very strong motivator. It can either be used as a carrot or a stick. And that's where Similarweb has come in really important for us, not just to shill what Similarweb does, but we use this quite often to basically show what the competitive set is doing and where you can either accelerate or at least find an opportunity for growth. So on the next slide, we'll use things across the board in some of our audits, basically to say, here's how we're performing in direct versus organic versus social versus the competitive set, and identify and benchmark these numbers to basically set goals. And this is a very strong motivator to upper management, whether it's showing how you're being outperformed at the keyword level or at the search traffic level. So on the next slide, you'll see some specific reports that we use. Like if I'm the NYT, for example, I'm looking at the device distribution breakdown. We use this often to show what is our audience tendency, first off, but also to show, hey, maybe we have specific problems with layout, with speed, with the mobile environment, and how and how the site is how we're interacting with the site based on device. If you go to the next slide, another thing that we use in initial audits is, of course, branded versus non-branded. And this is where you can hopefully win hearts and minds. And that's just because this will extend out to any brand. Doesn't matter how big or small the organization is. It's understanding like there are lucrative opportunities outside of just your brand. And sometimes that doesn't necessarily, sometimes certain factions within the company don't understand that. And that's where it really does take a chart. It takes numbers to prove out, to put a goal in front of specific teams and to basically set an objective and how that aligns with the company. Adam Shazad, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think, I think what Marshall was talking about with respect to brand goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Because if you think about, and this is sort of obvious, but think about non-branded traffic, right? So versus branded traffic, it's really about eventually converting to some degree of branded traffic, right? So what we're looking at here is, the opportunity to actually see what the landscape is, right? So here, for example, you see that CNN has 36% of non-branded traffic. That tells us a couple things. One is that it's obviously its share of the marketplace is higher, but it may be just the coverage scope of that site may be higher. And so what you can do here is actually drill down and see, for example, maybe it's their politics section, maybe it's their sports section, maybe it's their entertainment section that is actually overperforming versus yours. So this is a good entry point into trying to figure out where your deficiencies are on the non-brand side, and then trying to drill down from there, and then eventually obviously convert to brand.
Yeah, and Aaron, you're asking a good question about in the chat about how do you know a startup is ready for SEO, and I think you can think of it in a different way, and that gets into the next slide in the next section, which is around auditing, and that is what's good for the user is good for search, and what's good for search is good for the user. So that's instead of maybe branding it as as SEO, it can certainly be around user engagement. How do we increase the visibility? How do we increase the user engagement? And that is all foundational. And those foundational aspects are, and that's what makes SEO, I think, a fairly easy sell, is because typically it makes the site better. It makes the site run faster. It makes it easier to use. It makes discoverability better. It writes for the user. It finds the user where they're looking for information. There's so many different aspects that that SEO plugs into. That's where it spans interdepartments and benefits almost everybody. It almost benefits the entire organization, with the exception of a few. And that's how we use it as a catalyst for buy-in as well.
Yeah, one thing, the other way I sort of frame that is there's an opportunity cost to not doing SEO, especially at the beginning, right? Because then what happens is you wind up going along a path of unoptimized product marketing and editorial initiatives, and then sort of have to reverse back because those paths are not going to lead you to the organic search market share that you're looking to gain, right? So if you do it from the beginning, it's just going to be that much better. And so, I would say almost no matter what, like there should be SEO top of mind at the very beginning. It doesn't mean that you have to have a full-fledged 100% on the ground running SEO program, but anybody who's engaging in SEO for a site that's sort of kicking off the ground because it's a startup, they should at least have the basic best practices understood really well so that you can at least go along those paths, right? So making sure that paid speed is there, making sure that things like sitemaps are implemented, making sure that, if it applies, having AMP, ready to go. If not right off the bat, then at least in preparation for when you're ready. Having basic things like the SEO metadata best practices in place, like title tags and meta descriptions, et cetera. And URL structures are really important as well. So those are the things I'd say it's critical to understand conceptually so that you can apply them and you're not scrambling and ripping up things because you realize it was done in a way that just will not allow you to actually take advantage of SEO at all.
Yeah, I think you bring up two very good points. One of them is perception of a lot of people to SEO, because how a lot of people see it outside of SEO world is that SEO is for tricking Google to give you more traffic, when actually now Google is smart enough that you can't really trick it. It's more about being user-centric. It's building on user-centric experience, user-centric product, user-centric website. And then it helps you get more traffic because Google understands that you're focusing on benefits for users and potential customers. And the second really good point that you made is that it's way of positioning SEO more in the minds of your senior teams. It's if you tell them that you can improve your website by doing this audit and this kind of content and writing more on this topic, they won't really listen to you. But if you tell them that their competitor is doing this and they're better than you, they want to know what they're doing. And then they want to actually figure out what they can do better, so then they can grow more than their competitor. If you bring your competitor into conversation and you're telling that you're not doing something they're doing, it's a lot easier for you to sell SEO and SEO benefits.
Yeah, I agree.
And
also, I would like to add what Marshall mentioned, where SEO should be in the organization. Like for large companies that are really focused on user acquisition, when SEO actually sits under the acquisition and the marketing team, this is not the right approach. As Marshall pointed, in my experience, working under product, under growth is the best case. And also getting the buy-in for engineering is also very crucial, especially on all the technical tasks. Like some engineer doesn't know what's the impact of changing X, Y, and Z to traffic. So basically we need to understand that improving the performance by X% will lead to X amount of traffic, and so on and so on. By doing this and educating them, it's going to be easier for future tasks to be developed.
yeah, no, that's a very good point. And yeah, we can move to third section, which is website auditing process.
So as anybody that in audience development and works in SEO understands that all all SEO projects start with an audit. It's either a technical audit, it's a content audit, it's a competitive analysis audit. It's across the board. It's an important part. It's a foundational part to any launch point and any new initiative. So we usually start any engagement with a technical audit. As you see in the next slide, there's a lot of different crawlers out there. There's a lot of different approaches to it. There's wonderful there's wonderful checklists that everybody has put out. If you're reading any of the good technical SEOs out there, you'll understand that there's a lot of different ways to do that. So we don't necessarily need to get into so much the details of how to audit. That information is out there, and the approaches are usually, I would say fairly aligned. What I like to always think about and come from the perspective of is that, so you look at Google's mission statement, which is basically like, we want to organize the world's information. But what they've also talked about more recently, and I say more recently, I would say in the last 10 plus years, is that their idea of emulating a user experience. And they talk about this a lot. If you listen to the pundits out there, they want to emulate how a user interacts with the site. They want to do that from a crawl perspective, and then of course as they feature search results as well. And so what that does is it gives us an interesting operating perspective, and that is, sure, there's the technical implementation. So if we go to the next slide, there's technical implementations that, of course, that we can look at, and that is, we look at page speed, we look at the actual optimization of the content, we look at canonical issues, we look at linking, we map the site. We look at certain specifications and requirements that Google has, from redirects to mixed content, secure sites versus non-secure sites. Those are all important. The other aspect, again, to think about is, how do users engage with this site? And one thing that we look at are engagement metrics, and that is, how do users, once they're on the site, what do they do? And so there's been talk about, on the next slide, there's talk about those specific factors, which are how long a user is on a site, how many pages did they absorb once they came to the site, and did they leave? And so when you look at engagement metrics, these are important factors to consider, because they play into UX, they play into design, and they play into the tech of the site. Basically, from the technology standpoint, did that page load fast? Could I interact with it fast? All the core web vitals that we're starting to take into consideration now, and that we're going to be held accountable for in January, those become incredibly important. But also, once a user comes to the site, how do you engage them? How do you keep them on the site? And we use these as measurements. And these are benchmarks, of course, because they're a bit ethereal. How do you increase time on site? How do you increase pages per visit? So there's a lot of different ways that have been done. But if you go to the next slide, a lot of different publishers, and they do really lead the charge as far as these engagements this engagement cycle is concerned. Whether it's rivers of information, how you're followed down the page, whether it's most popular, editor picks. E-commerce has always been good when they show pricing models. These are ways to increase and engage and users in a way that will absolutely change those engagement metrics. And watching those and using those as a benchmark, we think are pretty important, because it has been strongly indicated that Google's paying attention to those. They give you this information in GA. They give you this information, and I'm assuming that's why Similarweb provides those as well. And you see those in other tools too. I think this has become a pretty important factor, and it certainly is, from a design, UX, and user engagement perspective, it's become a priority.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point. And did you find any best ways that you kind of suggest to increase engagement and staying on a page? Is there some best frameworks, or what do you start with? Is it best related topics, or is it just top topics on the site? What do you see usually work?
So a number of things, right? And one of the things that one of the easiest ways and what you're seeing here in the examples here is basically is the related aspect. I mean, basically when you're engaging with a particular topic, it really does require some technical muscle. And so this is where SEO does have to engage with tech, because that's where these particular modules that you find, and it's different across every site, but these different modules are probably, I'd say, the leading indicator of where, of how you increase time on site. And that is hopefully, if a user is engaged in a particular topic, sometimes you'll see midstream interruptions, speed bumps, if you will, of particular topics that will hopefully pique somebody's interest. But these are, Adam, you may have other ideas behind this, but we find top headlines, we find relateds that appear at the bottom of articles. Those are priority and primary ways that users are engaged.
Yeah, and it connects to just overall internal link support as well too. I mean, granted, those modules are fast moving, but for news content, it's that first, it's the first hours or certainly the first day that are most important. So we need to make sure we're constantly exposing links to fresh priority content, but also like on channel and sub-channel pages, and having a mix of priority content that's not necessarily brand new. So people are continuing to engage with that, and we're funneling internal link support to it as well. Some sites are looking at degrees of personalization, to try to increase those engagement signals as well. But sort of engagement, time on site, and a good internal link graph can all work together to support SEO.
I have something to add. So I can tell you from my experience working at Similarweb, we have over 100 million pages. And we did experiment. We basically removed over 20 million pages from the index that we had really poor engagement metrics. We had a high bounce rate, low page views, and very low time on site. And overall, we saw across the board improvement in all the engagement metrics, and also it led to improvement in rankings on a few terms that are not even related to the pages I removed. So I think the overall improvement led to increase in specific keywords that we weren't ranked really well.
Yeah,
especially for evergreen topics like addition by subtraction is a real thing. And you have publishers that have been around 10, 15 years. Like there can be a lot of junk that's left over that people haven't interacted with for a long time. And it's good to purge that stuff when you can.
Yeah, and this is where the editorial initiative actually dovetails into the technical, which is that, one of the reasons why it's probably successful, this sort of purging of older and legacy content is simply that you're improving crawl budget. You're focusing Googlebot on the content that's important to you now, rather than having it spin its wheels and expend resources on on content that is just not valuable either to your brand, the publisher as it sits right now, but also to users as well. So both of those things are in alignment in this case, right? Like the editorial imperative to cut because it's no longer valuable, it's no longer potentially even accurate content, and what that does is also improve crawl budget, and I think both of those things hand in hand wind up leading to some of these lifts that we've seen that Roy mentioned, but also other folks within the industry have publicized in terms of their experience with culling content and being consistent about it, right? Like not just having it a one-off project that you do, but actually doing it, let's say, on a quarterly basis or a semi-annually basis, where you're actually going through and having this part of your SEO workflow, rather than just saying, okay, this is one big project we're going to do, and then we'll be done with it, and then 5 years later doing it again.
Yeah, no, I think this is a very important point to actually make. And on the other side, we have still 2 more topics to go. And we have maybe 8 minutes to finish it off, so we can probably talk about best way to find relevant and trending content. Yeah, I think it's just out of your section, right? If you can maybe talk about this.
Sure. So if you want to get on to the next slide, please.
Yeah, of course.
So what we're trying to do right here is just provide you with, from a news publisher standpoint, what the best ways are of actually finding content that is actually of the moment, right? So one of the challenges with publishers and news publishers in particular is that the flux of keyword and the turnover of keywords is pretty high, right? So what's happening in the world one day changes so frequently to the next that understanding what those keyword terms are is sometimes challenging with traditional SEO tools, right? And so the single best tool I think that we have to figure out the content of the moment is Google Trends. And so learning the nuances and learning the capabilities of Google Trends really helps, especially with things like the related modules query and the rising modules query. That really does give you an insight not only into the seed term that you're looking at, so COVID-19, but what are people searching for related to COVID-19, what rising queries are happening on a up to hourly to 4-hour to day to 7-day basis, but also geographically, right? Like you can break it down by geography and all sorts of other ways. And so from that perspective, I think understanding the opportunities to drive traffic to very specific keyword targets on the news side, Google Trends is by far and away the most valuable tool. That being, sorry, go ahead.
No, I think where it gets important as well is the API. If you can utilize some technical resources and start pulling information from the API, this is where Google Trends gets really useful. And like Shahzad had said, it's on the surface level. I think everybody understands why Google Trends is important. It gives us some insight into some real-time into real-time searches that we may not have. Now it's noisy by all means. It's certainly noisy in there, but the seasonality aspect that you can derive from this data going back to 2004 is invaluable. So you can set an editorial calendar appropriately. And so I don't want to, we certainly don't want to overlook the fact that this is still a really, really important tool. In the next slide, we have, there's other features out there. There's other tools out there. Similarweb has a new one as well, where they're showing a 7-day news cycle, or excuse me, 7-day keyword cycles, and is helpful as well. BuzzSumo is still out there. NewsDash is John Shahada's company, or product and tool that he's put on the map that does real-time tracking of Google News for those publishers. But this is an evolving landscape, right? And it just basically comes down to where you're comfortable and what you're comfortable with, and more importantly, what you can also hand off to editorial teams and to product teams and to others that are managing SEO on a day-to-day basis. So the idea being that we don't want to be the gatekeeper of all this information. And so how do you educate and teach your teams to engage with like a Google Trends, for example, to go out, to take the 5 minutes to understand where the audience is engaging with a particular topic, utilize that so you don't have to be that information, that holder of all the information that's SEO.
So you're basically trying to empower them to do it themselves, so you don't have to be a middleman, basically just feeding them this information that they can technically understand themselves.
Exactly.
No, I think this is a great one, and it's definitely important to many industries, not only publishers. It's how to actually find topics constantly, and the newest ones and the most recent ones. And this is why actually we've been working on this product for last, like, I think 2 months, is on something that tells us the most recent topics, the most recent keywords, because that's what we've seen in the industry, especially now with all the changes. Everyone wants to know how things change in my industry, in my section of the actual competitor side. So it's a very, very important question that all businesses ask right now. And then we have the last section, which is measuring performance and reporting frameworks.
Yeah, so I think, you know, analytics has come a long way. You know, what we're seeing here is that there's more and more capability to provide sort of, you know, dashboards that create sort of, you know, as close to possible as sort of, you know, one-stop shop for analyzing all of the KPIs from the various sources. So something like, you know, Google Data Studio or Power BI allows you to actually integrate sources, you know, from different solutions like a Similarweb or like you know, Conductor or like you know, other tools out there that really provide various data, important data, but data that you have to then go to the platform for and then try to merge together. I think what we're trying to do here is say if there's a solution out there that provides a framework for understanding and synthesizing this data in one place, that's probably a, you know, a valuable thing to do, because it saves you time on sort of the aggregation of the data and allows you to focus more on the insights, and also allows you to make correlations between the different data sets, right? So you can see that one thing might be showing trends in one way, and then another aspect of data from another source maybe supporting that or contradicting that, and so you can sort of figure out what's going on there, you know, from the different sources, again, when it's all in sort of one window. And so, for example, Similarweb does have an API that you can implement in Google Data Studio. I've just put in a Search Console Explorer Studio that was done, and it was again just a really nice dashboard. There are a ton of them out there, so if you want to take a look, you know, they're really nice ones that are sort of pre-built, and all you have to do is just put in your credentials for you know, for your sites, and you can play with them as you need to. But they're really valuable. The other sort of frameworks that are important, if you want to go to the next slide, are frameworks that actually measure speed. Just because, you know, again, we've been talking about things like Core Web Vitals and the page performance initiative that Google has been embarking on. SpeedCurve is sort of another platform. There are a ton of them out there. We just chose this one because it does do a good job, we think, of integrating, let's say, things like Lighthouse integrations and the Core Web Vitals metrics. If you want to go to the next slide, we've got a couple of screenshots of, you know, the ways in which it presents this data. You know, I think that's really valuable, but fundamentally what we're trying to do is just provide those visuals. Sometimes those visuals are most impactful not at the granular level, but at the executive level, right? So just being able to show executives, for example, that, hey, you know, our page speed is slow. Here's the number, here's the top line number. That will get them moving to say, okay, what do we need to do to actually improve it? And then you can go into the details of that, but you can then obviously share these sort of top line metrics that just sort of, you know, provide sometimes, you know, frankly, the kick in the pants people need to actually get moving. And this goes back to, you know, the politics section that we talked about and getting the buy-in. Some of these analytics frameworks are so fundamental than actually getting that done, but you have to know how to use them, and you have to know how to derive the insights that you need to actually, you know, get the SEO initiative, you know, going for your organization.
Yeah, I think this is exceptionally useful because I remember when I used to do a similar analysis on different parts of the pages, I had to combine them in one spreadsheet and then send it off based on different parts of the website. And it was so difficult, and you had to like renew it every time after maybe a week to see if changes are made. So I think this report is great for speed, analysis.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is just another graphic that shows, like, again, this tool happens to be SpeedCurve, but you know, I'm sure there are others out there that do a good job giving you sort of the overview of exactly what the trending looks like for Lighthouse, or you can even build your own using APIs.
Okay, so I think we're going to take maybe just a couple of minutes to answer a couple of questions. I think one of them was, is there a way of actually understanding difference in engagement based on the source of traffic? So an example this person gives is is there an easy way to understand if someone stays 20% longer when they visit from YouTube than from Google?
Yeah, I mean, so typically any of these analytics platforms, whether that's Omniture or Adobe, will allow you to segment data from different sources. And so you can slice and dice the data, and let's say in this case it refers any way you need to. And so you can definitely look at YouTube traffic only. You can look at Google search traffic only. You can look at traffic from social only, and break down the engagement at a high level for each of those sources. And then you can also break it down for each of the subchannels within each of those. So traffic from Google versus traffic from Google News versus traffic from for social, Facebook versus Twitter versus Reddit, et cetera. So segmentation is the answer there. There are a lot of different ways to segment, and you should be able to do that within any of the analytics platforms. If you don't know how to do it, there's plenty of tutorials out there, for example, Google Analytics, that'll walk you through how to segment properly and then give you the answers you need.
Yeah, I think it's a great response. And the one more question is, does Google social search factor into organic SEO? From what I understand, that probably means if Google actually takes in social signals in its SEO.
I think they have to at this point, because of the rampant use of social and how things are, especially in the US, a lot of new and breaking news is conveyed and is utilized via Twitter and Facebook to a lesser degree. So, but Twitter is absolutely a part of this, and you do see those being featured. You see those tweets being featured from government officials, et cetera. And so I think while I think that content will always play out, and on the longer term, I think that content will always be more critical and more useful and more beneficial. We can't hide the fact that it is an important aspect of this, and we start to see that those levels of those particular engagement metrics, or when it comes around Twitter, have an effect, which is, the number of followers, how many people viewed it, and how many retweets it got. Those seem to be playing into it. I think that Google will probably, hopefully, start moving away from that. But for now, we have no choice but to pay attention to it.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. They have to, because there's so much audience is there and actually looking at stuff on social. But yeah, I think this is a perfect time for us to wrap up. And thanks, guys. I think this was one of the most advice-full webinar we had. Thanks for your expertise and giving us such great advice throughout the whole section.
Pleasure.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Appreciate the time.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for joining.